Matthew Coller joins us now. He covers the Vikings for 1500 ESPN. He writes about why everybody was wrong about Case Keenum, this undrafted, unwanted guy. He's bounced around. He backed up Nick Foles. He was 0-8 as a starter at one season in Houston. A couple other games in Houston didn't go so well. St. Louis, L.A. Matthew, Minnesota. Did they want Case Keenum? Have they come around to finally say, this is our guy, or are there still people wondering what if somebody else was under center?
Still are. I mean, the way that game ended the other night was incredible and magical and a moment that Vikings fans will never forget. But what they will probably forget that the team won't is some of the throws that Case Keenum made that put them in that position. I mean, at one point they're up 17-7, and it looks like they're in control of the game, and the defense is just going to keep shutting it down. And then Keenum throws a wild floating pass into the secondary that ends up getting intercepted and kind of sends a lightning bolt through Drew Brees, and all of a sudden Keenum is in a place where he's got to come back in that game. And I think what you had was the whole Case Keenum experience where he does some really good things, some really bad things, and then struggles at times to move the ball, but then is basically had a horseshoe around his neck the entire season, and this is kind of how things have gone. But I'm not sure that everyone is convinced that he's the quarterback of the future in Minnesota, or even a guy that you can completely trust going into the NFC title game.
So do you think that puts added pressure on him as each round he goes to, that he has no assurances, or is he just playing with house money saying, hey, I've got us this far, I'm going to play with my hair on fire? Or do you think that as you are around him each week that he has more and more pressure on him because he's potentially trying to become the quarterback of this team moving forward?
Yeah, one of the things that I discovered kind of in my research for my article, which thank you for promoting that, was that teams didn't know when he was coming out of college the level of mental toughness that Case Keenum has, and I didn't know that until we really saw it at work throughout this season. There was a section of this year where Mike Zimmer, without question, wanted to bench Case Keenum to go to Teddy Bridgewater once Bridgewater was back. I mean, Bridgewater was this team's franchise quarterback before he suffered the knee injury, and each week media would come in and ask, okay, so are you naming Keenum the starter for the rest of the year? And Zimmer would say, nope, not doing that. And so basically it always looked like Zimmer was hovering his finger over the button, and yet each week Keenum would go out there feeling like his starting job was on the line and just continue to perform. And it's probably the same situation here where you just haven't seen this guy crumble. You haven't seen him be a selfish type of player or make any sort of comments that would indicate that he's frustrated with the situation. And from all indications, the Vikings haven't even talked to him about a contract extension or anything like that. But none of that stuff seems to bother Case Keenum, and maybe it's just that he's been underrated and underappreciated for his entire life, so this is kind of his normal.
Matthew Coller, 1500 ESPN, here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Talk a little bit about that. Now, for this story, you really kind of chronicled, going all the way back for this kid. He's kind of always been the underdog. This is a guy who has the most passing yards in NCAA history, was undrafted. He's bounced around the league, but kind of give us some indication of where he came from and how he's persevered to get to the NFC Championship game.
Yeah, I mean, even going back to high school, he was a two-star recruit, so he wasn't a guy that was on anybody's radar, really, and he ends up going to Houston, and not just one great record-setting season, but he had 3 seasons where he threw for over 5,000 yards and put up historically great numbers. But the thing was, when it got to the combine, he was one of the worst when it came to his 40-yard dash, his height, his hand size, all those things that teams overvalue. And it was almost like they just couldn't give him credit for the things he did actually on the field and on tape. And there's also another thing that I think is wrong that NFL evaluators do, which is they ding a guy for being in a good system. The spread offenses and things like that, they say, well, it's not a pro system or whatever else. So I think that really caused him to be overlooked when it came to the draft. And then you ran through the places he had gone before, whether it was Houston or the Rams. I mean, he was playing a couple years under Jeff Fisher there, and we know that Jeff Fisher is kind of a coach from the past. And also, last year in Los Angeles, his number one receiver was Kenny Britt, who got cut by the Browns this year. So the guy never had a good enough situation to really show what he can do. Now he comes here with a brilliant offensive coordinator, two of the best wide receivers in the NFL, a running game, a number one defense, and now we're seeing that Case Keenum, at very least, I don't know if he's a guy you pay $20 million a year, but I know that he can certainly start in the NFL and win games.
Matthew, Sam was here, obviously, very polarizing. Either people liked him or just thought he couldn't play. The injuries are always an issue. How well liked was Bradford there? If the fans could choose of the three, it's a very unique situation. You got three guys. If the fans could choose one guy to be healthy and be their guy, rank them.
I think it would be Teddy Bridgewater number one, and then Keenum number two, and probably Sam Bradford number three. But I'm not sure how fair that is to Bradford exactly. I mean, talk about a guy that had bad breaks all the way around. I mean, I think that with Bradford, because he was a top pick and because he didn't perform right away with the Rams, and then, it kind of looked like he earned a lot of money for not doing a whole lot. I think there was some frustration with him from several different fan bases, but here last year, he performed pretty darn well considering they lost both of their starting tackles by week 3 and couldn't run the ball. And lost a couple players on defense, too, that ended up hurting him down the stretch. I think people were pretty happy with Bradford's overall performance, and then he comes out in week 1 and just goes completely bananas and throws for 346 yards and 3 touchdowns. And I think the general thought is here about Bradford, if he was given this situation that Keenum has had, he might have performed even better. But Bridgewater is still one of the most popular Minnesota Vikings players. And talk about another guy that had a tough situation when he went to the playoffs and was a Blair Walsh kick away from winning a playoff game. So there's a lot of love still for Bridgewater, and I think that exists in the organization too, and in Mike Zimmer's mind too, that there's a possibility he could even be the starting quarterback next year.
So in Minnesota, if the fans are concerned about losing to Philadelphia, is it because Case Keenum's our quarterback? Is it because Philadelphia's just better? Is it because Philadelphia's defense? What is coming up as maybe the reason fans might not believe they can win in Philly?
I think it's
even if that's even their opinion.
Oh, it's definitely there. Yeah, I mean, Vikings fans, as you would know, with the Eagles fans, I mean, they've been through a lot in the playoffs, so they always expect things to go sideways. The other night, everyone was in a state of shock that something actually went their way. But I think it's the Eagles' defensive line that scares Vikings fans the most, because if they pressure Case Keenum, he struggled a lot under pressure against New Orleans, and I think the defensive line for the Eagles is even better. And if you can shut down the run and force Case Keenum to beat you with his arm, that's going to be a pretty tough proposition. And the other thing is, too, the Vikings are playing a different combination of offensive linemen because they lost their starting left guard. So they moved their right tackle over to left guard and are playing a backup right tackle who will likely face off with Brandon Graham quite a bit. And that's not a matchup that you really love either. So you could see, I think the biggest fear is probably if they can't run and then Keenum is forced to make plays and he throws an interception like he did against New Orleans, and then they can't recover with some magical play.
We talked a lot about the two teams' defenses. Minnesota statistically is number 1. Philadelphia is number 3. And we talk a lot about the numbers and how the 16-game sample size is interesting, Matthew, where the Eagles played 16 games. Only 3 of them were against playoff teams. The Vikings played 16 games. 5 of them were against playoff teams. So do you think the numbers legitimately tell the story of the Vikings defense?
I do, yeah. I think that if they're not number 1, then they belong in the top 5. Even if you adjusted for their competition because of the way that they performed when they faced off with really good quarterbacks. I mean, I will say the other night, Drew Brees was doing things that almost no quarterbacks ever can do, making incredible throws to bring them back in that game. But, when they faced good offenses like the Rams especially, they performed really, really well. The only thing you might be concerned about a bit is how much better their defensive numbers are at getting after the quarterback at home versus on the road. I mean, a lot of teams play worse on the road, but there's a really big gap with this defense in terms of sacking the quarterback going on the road. So if they can't get a whole lot of pressure on Nick Foles, and the other thing is, too, they might be missing one of their starting safeties, Andrew Sendejo, who suffered a concussion in the game. And that, it's one of those things with this defense. It kind of reminds me of, remember that Detroit Pistons team that won the championship, but they didn't have any real stars? I mean, this defense has a lot of real stars, but if you were to take one player off, it's like you need every one of those things clicking. If you take one player off, they're not the same. And I think that might be the case with Andrew Sendejo. So that's going to be something to watch for sure. But I think this defense is absolutely as legit as its numbers.
Matthew Coller, 1500 ESPN Minnesota. How long did it take them to get over the euphoria of the way that game ended? We're at Tuesday now. Are they past it? Is it still lingering in Mankato?
Well, I think that Mike Zimmer made it quite clear that he was over it because he started his press conference by ripping his team for 4 or 5 different mistakes that they made in the second half of that game. So he brought everybody in and told them, we're over it now, we're moving on. And the signs of that were in the locker room, too. I mean, Stephon Diggs did not want to talk to the media because he said he was over it and doesn't want to get asked about it anymore, at least for now. I'm sure when the national media shows up tomorrow that he'll get asked about it quite a bit. And also, Harrison Smith, I talked to Harrison Smith right after it happened, and to me, he's the best player on the Minnesota Vikings. And his exact comment to me was, I was talking to some other guys about how we got to move on from this. Just after it happened. So I think this team is a lot of veterans, a lot of professionals who have been around a while, and they know that the expectation for this team is now the Super Bowl, and so they're not a team that's going to be happy to be here. They're a team that is looking at Super Bowl or bust, basically.
Matt, you look at the Shurmur, who is in an interesting – he's kind of – to me, I talked about this at the start of the show. He's kind of the underrated swing guy in all this. I mean, he's here with Chip Kelly with really no ties. Kelly gets fired. He's the interim guy, and everybody says just keep him around so that him and Bradford have the continuity. They hire Doug, and Shurmur goes to Minnesota. Teddy goes down, and I'm sure Pat must have had some influence to say, look, Philly's got quarterbacks. I know Sam. Let's go after him. And now he could be heading to New York and going against the Eagles. So Pat Shurmur's got an interesting role in all of this. How important has he been to Case Keenum in Minnesota?
Yeah, it's like a weird butterfly effect thing, right? I can confirm what you said. Yes, they did consult Shurmur heavily in the decision to bring in Sam Bradford. But, Shurmur might be the MVP of the offense. I mean, it's very rare that a fan base unequivocally loves their offensive coordinator because every one of us plays Madden and thinks we could call plays better. But I can tell you, I'm pretty good at Madden, and I can't call plays better than Pat Shurmur. You have seen an incredible jump from this offense, not just because they brought in a couple offensive linemen, but from last year to this year with him taking over as the full-time offensive coordinator. And the areas where you see it are where he's most creative. Third down and short, they're one of the best teams in the NFL. The red zone, the goal line, finding ways to constantly get in the end zone where in the past they had really struggled, finding ways to get Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen the ball, and just using guys to their strengths. Adam Thielen was mostly an outside wide receiver in the past, but this year 50% of his snaps were from the slot. Even though he's not a traditional slot guy, Shurmur knew that would create some mismatches for a receiver that good where he could find some open space, and it's worked out brilliantly for not only Adam Thielen but also Case Keenum to make a lot of easy throws that turn into big plays. I mean, it kind of reminds you what he's done this year, a lot of what Chip Kelly did in 2013 with Nick Foles. So I think that Shurmur has done a tremendous job, and I don't know, being a head coach is different from being an OC, but I think he's exactly what the Giants need for their offense.
Matthew, good catching up, and the Vikings will be in town in Philadelphia for the NFC Championship game. 2 improbable guys. And, oh, by the way, Foles started over Keenum and lost his job to Case, and now they'll square off. One of them will go to the Super Bowl. What a unbelievably improbable thing. And check out his piece at 1500ESPN.com on why everyone was wrong about Case Keenum. It's a old-school, long-form piece that you don't get to see that much anymore, but really good piece, Matthew. I appreciate the time.
All right, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.